Hello, everybody. Welcome to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today comes from Europe and from the country of Germany. This is the story of a brother and sister and how they took care of each other and found their way home. The tale of Hansel and Gretel. Once long ago, there was a family: mother, father, brother, sister. The brother and sister's name were Hansel and Gretel. Now, sadly, the mother died, and after a while, father remarried. But while the woman he married was pretty enough on the outside, she wasn't a very kind woman on the inside, and she really wasn't ready for the life of a woodcutter, which is what father did. He cut wood he would go into the forest and cut down wood and gather up the wood that had fallen, and then he would take it into the village and he would sell it in the village, and people would use it to cook their food and keep their houses warm and that sort of thing. But when things don't go so well in the village and in the city and in the country and general, people started to go into the woods and gather their own wood instead of waiting for father to go and gather it for them. And so he was having trouble selling his wood in the village. And when he was having trouble selling his wood in the village, then he didn't have as much money to buy food, and very soon, father and stepmother and Hansel and Gretel were running out of food. And the father and the stepmother started to talk about what they could do. They had to find a way to either get more food or sell more wood or something. Well, father was trying to come up with ways, and stepmother said, "I know what we can do. We can take the children into the woods and leave them there. And then we won't have to feed them anymore. Why, Hansel eats almost as much as you do." Of course, father did not want to do that. He didn't want to leave his children in the woods to maybe be eaten by a wolf or taken by strangers and bandits. He did not want that. But stepmother would not let go of the idea. And pretty soon, father and stepmother were arguing and shouting at each other. Now, Hansel and Gretel had gone upstairs to bed already, and they had been sleeping, but all of the shouting woke up Hansel. And when Hansel heard all of the shouting, he crept out of his bed very quietly, and he crept up to the top of the stairs, and he listened to what father and stepmother were arguing about. And he heard what they were saying. And eventually, Hansel heard father say, "Okay, okay, okay. I don't like it, but you're right. There's no other way. We'll have to take the children into the woods tomorrow and leave them there." He wasn't very happy about it, and Hansel could hear it in his voice. But Hansel also knew he was a smart lad, and he knew that there wasn't enough food to feed all of them. But he didn't want to get left in the woods, and he definitely didn't want his little sister to get left in the woods. And so Hansel thought for a little while, and as he heard father and stepmother go to bed, he was thinking and thinking, and then he thought of a plan. And when he was so sure that there was nobody awake downstairs to hear him, he crept down the stairs and over to the front door of the house, and he reached up and he took down the key that hung next to it, and he unlocked the door very quietly and carefully, and he slipped out into the garden. And when he got out into the garden, there were pebbles, little stones all over the ground outside the house. And Hansel gathered them up. They were little white pebbles. And he gathered them up and he picked up as many as he could possibly stuff into his pockets of his pants. And then he went back upstairs to bed. Well, the next morning, stepmother woke up the children and she said, "Come quickly. You're going to go with us into the woods today to cut the wood for your father to sell." Well, Gretel was so excited. She loved going with father when he went into the woods. And Hansel, well, he tried to act as excited as he normally would. and he hoped that nobody realized that he really wasn't very excited at all. Well, there wasn't much for breakfast, so it was very quickly finished with. And then stepmother gave each of the children a stale piece of bread and said, "That's all you'll have for your supper, so save it until later." And they started out towards the woods. Now Hansel was lagging just a little bit behind everybody else. He wasn't walking as fast as everyone, and he kept turning about. And every time he turned around, he reached into his pocket and dropped one of the little white pebbles in the middle of the path. And stepmother called out to him and said, "Hansel, come along. You've got to keep up. You're going to get lost. Don't keep, why are you dawdling so?" He said, "Well, I'm just looking to see if my little white cat is sitting on the roof watching us." Stepmother said, "Your little white cat is probably in the barn catching mice. It's not on the roof. Come along." And so Hansel hurried to catch up, but he still kept every once in a while reaching into his pocket and dropping a pebble on the ground, very carefully. Well, when they were deep in the woods, Father stopped in a clearing and he said, "Children, I can see that you're getting a little tired. So we're going to build a little fire here so that you can stay warm. And then your stepmother and I will go into the woods and we will cut the wood and gather the wood so we can go sell it, and we'll come back and get you." And so Father built a little fire so that Hansel and Gretel would have a little fire, and he made sure that Hansel had plenty of wood to keep it going for a while. And then he and stepmother walked off into the woods, and for a little while they could hear Father's axe on the trees, and after a while they couldn't hear it anymore. And Gretel ran about and played and jumped in the leaves, and she was just having fun, and Hansel had some fun with her. But after a while, Gretel got rather tired. And they realized that it was starting to get dark. And Father hadn't come back yet, and Gretel got a little scared, and she began to cry. And Hansel said, "Don't cry, Gretel, it's okay." And she said, "What if Father doesn't come back for us?" And Hansel said, "It's okay, Gretel. I dropped these little pebbles." He had a few left in his pocket, and he showed her. He said, "I dropped these on the path so that we wouldn't get lost when we left the path to come find wood. So we can just follow these pebbles home, but it's too dark to follow them right now. So why don't you take a little bit of a nap, and when the moon comes up and we can see the pebbles again, I'll wake you up." So Gretel said, "Well, okay." She felt safe with her big brother, especially since she knew he was taking care of her like this. And so she laid down and she laid her head in his lap and she had herself a little nap. And Hansel sat there and he was tired, but he made sure he stayed awake. And he was a little bit scared, if he was being truthful, but he was pretty sure the pebbles should work okay. And when the moon came up and shone its light down on the forest, sure enough, Hansel looked over towards where he thought they had come from, and he could see the pebbles shining, leading away from the clearing they were sitting in. And so he woke up Gretel, and he showed her the pebbles, and together they made their way home through the forest. Now they got home pretty early in the morning. The sun was just starting to come up. And Father was so happy to see them. Stepmother, not so much. And Father knew that it would not be very long before stepmother would start arguing that they should leave the children in the woods again. And he tried his hardest to think of a reason that they didn't need to leave the children. He tried his hardest to think of ways that he could get more money so that they would have enough food to eat. But he couldn't think of any. And stepmother pestered and bothered and nagged at him so much that finally he said, okay, we'll take the children into the woods again. And he very much hoped that they would find their way out again somehow. Well, of course, Hansel, he kind of had an idea that stepmother wasn't going to give up that easily too. And so he had been listening to father and stepmother very carefully at night when they would argue. and he heard Father give in and say they would take the children into the woods again. And so when they were all asleep, Hansel crept down the stairs again, and he went to the door, but it was locked. And the hook where the key normally hung was empty. So he couldn't get out to go gather more pebbles. Well, Hansel went back up to his bed, and he lay there for a while thinking, trying to think of a way that he could manage to get himself and Gretel back out of the forest again. And he thought for a while, and then eventually he thought of it. Stepmother was sure to give them another piece of bread, and he could just crumble his up and drop the crumbs, and then they would be able to follow the crumbs out of the forest. And so Hansel went to sleep. And the next morning, Stepmother woke them up and told them they were all going into the forest again. Gretel wasn't quite as excited as she had been the time before, but she was happy to go into the forest with Father and Hansel and Stepmother. And Hansel just got up and he ate his little bit of breakfast, and then he took his piece of bread and they started to walk. And Hansel crumbled up the piece of bread, and every so often he dropped some breadcrumbs. And then he dropped a few more. And they continued walking deep into the woods, and they went a different direction this time than they had gone the time before. Now, I don't know about you, but I've sometimes gone out and thrown bread outside on the ground. Have you ever noticed what happens when you throw bread on the ground? The birds like bread. And so they come down and they pick up the bread and they eat it. And unfortunately, after Father and Stepmother had built a little fire and left Hansel and Gretel in the forest and gone, and Gretel had started to cry again, and Hansel told her it was okay, he had a way to get them out. When the moon came up, he woke up Gretel, and they started looking for the trail of breadcrumbs to follow it out of the forest. And it wasn't there, because the birds had eaten them all. And now Gretel started to cry again, and she said, Hansel, how will we ever find our way home? And he said, it's okay, Gretel. We'll do it. We'll find our way home. I know we will. Trust me. It will be okay. And Gretel trusted her brother, and so she put her hand in his, and they started to walk. And they walked for a while, and then they sat down and they rested for a while, and then they walked for a while more. And they walked and rested and walked and rested all night and all the next day and all the next night. And the next day, well, Gretel was tired and she was hungry. Have you ever been so hungry that you just couldn't walk anymore, or so tired that you just couldn't walk anymore? Well, that's how Gretel felt. So she sat down on the ground and she said, Hansel, I can't walk anymore. I am so tired and I'm so hungry. And we're never gonna get out of this forest, Hansel. And Hansel said, Gretel, I know you're tired and you're hungry. I'm tired and hungry too. But we won't get out of the forest if we just sit on the ground and whine about it. We have to keep moving. We have to keep walking. Eventually, we'll get to the edge of the forest, or to a path, or to something. And so Gretel, she knew Hansel was right, and so she got up, and she got ready to start walking again. But just then, she spotted something up in the tree. She said, Hansel, what's that? And when they looked a little closer, they saw that it was a beautiful white bird. They'd never seen a bird so beautiful before. And when the bird saw that they were watching it, it took off from the tree it was in, and it flew to the next tree, and it stopped. And it looked back at them. And they went towards it a little bit, just to see it a little better. And the bird took off from the tree and flew to the next one and stopped and looked back at them again. And Hansel said, I think that bird wants us to follow it. Maybe it will lead us out of the forest, Gretel. Maybe it will lead us to a path or to somebody who can help us find our way out of the forest. And so Hansel and Gretel, suddenly, they felt like they had a little more energy. And they started to follow the white bird. And it would fly along until it got a ways ahead of them, but not out of sight. And then it would land in a tree and wait until they caught up. And then it would take off and fly again until it got far enough away, and it would sit in a tree and they would walk up and catch up with it. And that kept on going for a while until finally the white bird flew into a clearing in the forest and it perched on something. And Hansel and Gretel hurried out of the forest and they stood in the clearing so surprised at what they saw. It was a house. Now, a house is not very surprising. But what was surprising about this house is what it was made out of. The walls looked like they were made out of gingerbread with little cakes hung on them. And the roof was made out of cookies. And the windows looked like they might be made out of spun sugar. It was the oddest looking house Hansel and Gretel had ever seen. And as they came a little closer, just to see it a little better, Gretel's stomach growled. And she said, Hansel, do you think whoever lives here might mind if we had a little snack? We're so hungry. Maybe just a cake or two, or a cookie, or something? Hansel said, well, people are generally very kind. I don't think whoever lives here would mind too terribly if we had a little something to eat. And so he reached up to the roof and he handed Gretel a cookie, and he took one for himself. And when he finished his cookie, it was so good, he took another one. And Gretel finished her cookie, her cookie, and it was so tasty that she reached up to the wall and she pulled off a cake, and she started to eat the cake. Well, the two of them had been eating for a little while, and they had done some serious damage to the outside of the house, when suddenly the door of the house opened and a very old woman came out, leaning on a stick. And Hansel and Gretel were so startled, and they stopped eating immediately. Oh, we're so sorry. We were so hungry. We were just having a bit of a snack. We're so sorry. And the old woman said, oh, you poor children. Of course you're hungry. Oh, it's not a problem, dearie. Come along inside. I'll make you something a bit more fattening for supper. How would that be? And then I have a nice, lovely, soft bed that you could stay in for the night. You can stay with me for a while. Well, Hansel and Gretel thought that sounded nice. Supper and a nice, soft bed. And perhaps they could stay with the old woman and help her around the house a bit to make up for the pieces of her house that they had eaten. And so they went inside the house, and the old woman busied herself, and she made a bunch of pancakes, and she made a bunch of sausages, and she put some fruit on the pancakes, and she made them lovely and gave them some sugar to sprinkle on them. Oh, it was delicious supper. It was the most wonderful supper ever. And then she took them into the bedroom, and she showed them the lovely soft bed that she had for them to sleep in, and they laid down and fell asleep very quickly, for of course they were very tired, and now their tummies were very full, and so they were very sleepy. Well, unfortunately, Hansel and Gretel had never seen a witch. And if they had seen a witch, or if they'd known just a little bit more about them, they would have known that this old lady was a witch, because her eyes were very red. But they didn't know any better. And so they went to sleep peacefully. But the next morning, The witch woke them up very early in the morning. She came in and she grabbed Hansel by the back of the neck, by the back of his shirt collar, and she grabbed him and she dragged him out of the house and she took him behind the house and she locked him in a cage. And then she went into the house and she woke up Gretel and she said, "Wake up, child. You need to go fetch some water. Your brother is in the cage in the back of the house and we are going to cook all day today. Wonderful treats, pies and goodies and turkeys and chickens and all of the wonderful things for him to eat, for I'm going to fatten him up, and then in a week I'm going to bake him in my oven and eat him, and then it will be your turn." And all of a sudden Gretel realized that this woman must be a witch, and that she had probably trained that little white bird to fly out into the forest and find lost little children and bring them back to her so that she could eat them. Well, Gretel started crying, but there wasn't much she could do, for the witch was very cruel if Gretel didn't do what the witch asked her to. And so she went and she fetched water and she helped the witch cook all day long. And they took potatoes and chickens and vegetables and pies and cookies and cakes and all sorts of delicious food to eat out to Hansel in the cage. And he ate some of it, and some of it he left outside and the wild animals came and ate it. But Gretel was only given bread and water to eat and drink. That was it. No milk, no cheese, no lovely foods. Well, at the end of a week of baking and cooking and all sorts of delicious things, the witch went out to the cage and she said, "Hansel, stick out your finger so that I can feel it and see how fat and plump you're getting." Now, you might wonder why the witch didn't just look at Hansel. The problem is, when you've been a witch for a while, your eyesight gets to be not so good. And this witch had been a witch for a very long time, so she really couldn't see very well. And so she needed Hansel to stick out his finger out of the cage bar so she could feel his finger and feel how fat it was getting. Well, Hansel was a very clever boy, and he knew that if the witch felt his finger getting fat and plump, the witch would cook him right away. And so he looked about very quickly on the bottom of the cage and he found a chicken bone from his supper from the night before. And he took that chicken bone and he stuck it out through the bars of the cage. And the witch felt the chicken bone and "Well, that's very odd. You've eaten everything I've given you and you're not getting any fatter. We'll have to try another week." And so another week came of cooking and baking delicious foods and not being able to eat any of them for poor Gretel. And Hansel got all of the delicious foods and he ate some of them and the rest he put outside for the wild animals. And he snuck some to his sister from time to time. And then at the end of the week, the witch came out and she said, "Hansel, put out your finger. I need to see how plump you're getting." And Hansel found another chicken bone and he stuck it out. And the witch said, "Well, that's not right." And she cooked again. And she tested again. And again, Hansel gave her a chicken bone. Well, at the end of a month of all of this cooking and baking and Hansel seemingly not getting any plumper, the witch decided she was done waiting. She was just going to cook Hansel up. And so she went to her big oven that she had that was big enough to fit a child inside, and she started a fire in it, and she got it nice and hot. And then she said to Gretel, "Now, Gretel, I need you to stick your head in the oven and tell me if it's hot enough in there yet." Now, Gretel was also a rather clever girl, and she knew that if she stuck her head in the oven, the witch would just push her in and bake her first, and then she would bake Hansel, and there wouldn't be anybody to stop her. And so Gretel decided that she was going to pretend that she was stupid. And she said, "I would love to help you, Granny," because that's what the witch had told her to call her, "but I'm not really sure how? How do you test to see how hot it is? It feels hot enough from here, but I don't know how to test it and see if it's hot enough. And the witch said, you just stick your head inside. Stick my head inside? I don't know how, Granny. The door's over here and I can't, I'm not sure how. Will you please show me? And so the witch said, oh, you silly child, you just do like this. And she walked over and she stuck her head in the oven. Well, Gretel knew that that was her best chance of getting rid of the witch. And so she came up behind her very quickly and she pushed her into the oven and she slammed the door and locked it. Well, the witch had magic, but not enough magic to get herself out of a locked oven and not enough magic to stop herself from burning up. And so she died. And Gretel went very quickly to the cage at the back of the house and she freed Hansel and they both went inside and they ate a little more food because they were rather hungry by this time. And then Gretel said, Hansel, I have seen where the witch keeps all of her riches. She has jewels and gold and all sorts of things. Do you think those would help Father if we brought some of them home with us? And Hansel said, well, I don't think it would hurt. And so they went to the loose floorboard in the hallway where the witch kept all of her gold and her jewels, and they lifted it out and they took as many jewels and gold out as they could stuff into their pockets. Hansel stuffed the pockets of his pants and Gretel stuffed the pockets on her apron. And when they were as full as they could possibly be and not everything fall out of them, Hansel and Gretel left the witch's house and started walking through the forest again. Now, after a little while, they had been walking for a bit and they came to a big expanse of water. They weren't really sure if it was a lake or a river, but it was a lot of water. And they could see that it was big enough that they weren't going to be able to go around it very easily. And it was far enough across that there was no way they could walk it, wade across, or swim across, or nothing. They didn't know how they were going to get across it. Well, after a little while, as they were sitting there trying to think of a way to get across, Gretel saw something floating out on the lake, and she realized it was a duck. And she called out to it. She said, oh, little duck friend, little duck friend. And the duck came swimming over. And Gretel said, little duck friend, we're trying to get to the other side of the water. Do you know how we could do it? And the duck just looked at her and she said, little duck friend, do you think maybe you could take us across? Well, the little duck swam away, and a few minutes later, it came back with a bigger duck. And the bigger duck swam right up to the edge of the water and just sat there waiting for them. And Gretel said, Hansel, Hansel, quick, the duck is going to take us across the water. And she said, but I think it's not big enough for both of us. I think perhaps I should go first, and then I will send the duck back for you, and then you can come across. And Hansel said, well, all right then. And so Gretel climbed on the back of the duck, and the big duck swam across the water and left her on the other side. And then she said, please, could you go back and get my brother? And the duck turned around and it swam back across the water, and Hansel climbed on its back, and it swam across the water with Hansel. And when it got to the other side, Gretel said, well, thank you so much, duck friend. Here, I have a piece of bread. Thank you. And she gave the duck a piece of bread that she had brought with her from the witch's house. And the duck quacked at her, and the big duck and the little duck swam off to share the bread. Well, Hansel and Gretel turned around and they left the side of the water and they started to walk. And pretty soon, Hansel said that he thought this part of the forest looked rather familiar. And sure enough, a little further on, Gretel started to recognize some of the trees and the clearings and things that she was seeing. And very soon, they saw the path that led back to their father's house. And they ran down the path as fast as they could. And when they got to the house, they could see there was smoke coming out of the chimney, so they knew someone was home. And they ran into the house, and they found their father sitting at the table with his head in his hands, looking very sad. And they said, "Father, Father, Father, we've come home." And they ran in and they hugged him, and he was so surprised and so happy to see them. And they hugged him and he hugged them, and he told them that their stepmother had died and that he had been so sorry that he had left them in the forest ever since, and he'd been trying to find them and trying to figure out how to find them in the forest ever since. And so Hansel said, "Well, Father, we've come home and we'll never have to worry about money again. Well, not for a while at any rate." And he reached into his pockets and he pulled out all the jewels and gold that he had brought from the witch's house. And Gretel reached in the pockets of her aprons and she poured out all of her jewels and gold on the table that they had brought from the witch's house. And the father said, "You know, the jewels and the gold are very nice and they will be helpful. But I am the most happy to have my Hansel and my Gretel back with me. You are better than jewels and gold to me. I love you so very much." And they hugged each other tightly. And the next day, Father went into the town, and he sold some of the jewels, and he spent some of the gold, and they had plenty of food that night for dinner. And in truth, they had plenty of food for the rest of their lives, for it turned out the jewels and the gold were quite enough to keep them very comfortably living for the rest of their days, and they lived very happily together. And that is the story of Hansel and Gretel. Comes to us from Germany, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you'll join us again on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Central Time. We'll have another story for you from somewhere around the world. So have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.